Stories of the Second Dutch War, by Alfred H. Miles. B.Y. John Campbell. The Second Dutch War was declared in Holland in January and in England in February, 1665. It arose out of the conflicts of the rival companies of Dutch and English merchants in the East and West Indies and in Africa, and the refusal of Charles II to remedy a condition of things which had become unendurable. In 1664, the Dutch sent an embassy to the English court to complain of the depredations from which they suffered at the hands of the Anglo-African Company, of which the king's brother, the Duke of York, was then governor. But the king replied that he had received no particular information of the affairs in question and that the rival companies must settle their differences among themselves. On the other hand, the English merchants appealed to him with so much persistence that he finally demanded satisfaction of the Dutch. The first action of consequence that happened after the war actually broke out was an attack made upon a Dutch fleet coming richly laden from Smyrna upon the Spanish coast near Cadiz. This consisted of 40 merchant ships, some of them very large, and well provided with ordnance, and their convoy was composed of 4 third-rate men of war. Sir Thomas Allen, who commanded the English squadron, had with him about 9 ships. With these he attacked the enemy so successfully that, having killed their commodore, Brackle, and taken or sunk 4 of their richest ships, he drove the rest into the Bay of Cadiz, where for some time he blocked them up. A misfortune of the same kind befell the Dutch Bordeaux fleet, out of which about 130 ships were taken. These heavy misfortunes obliged the Dutch to lay an immediate embargo on all vessels in their ports, by which their fisheries and their annual commerce were stopped for that season. They likewise settled a fund of 14 millions of guilders for the support of the war, and, in order to show that there ought to be some difference between such wars as are made by trading nations, and those entered into by arbitrary princes, for the mere thirst of dominion, they ordered about 50 English and Scotch vessels, which had been seized in their harbors, to be set at liberty. And, on the arrival of these ships in England, the civility was returned by a like release of all the Dutch ships that had been stopped here. The English fleet, which was the first ready, consisted of 114 sail of men of war and frigates, 28 fireships and ketches, having about 22,000 seamen and soldiers on board. The whole was commanded by the Duke of York, as Lord High Admiral. Prince Rupert was Admiral of the White, and the Earl of Sandwich, who, as Captain Montague, had won distinction under Blake, was Admiral of the Blue. On Apist, 1665, the English sailed for the Dutch coast, and on the 28th sent in a squadron so near the shore and harbor of the Texel that the country was exceedingly alarmed. After remaining there a month, however, the fleet was so ruffled by a storm that it was found necessary to retire towards our own shore. This opportunity the Dutch took of sending out their fleet, which, by the latter end of May, appeared about the Dogger Sands. It was divided into 7 squadrons, the first under Admiral Opdam, consisting of 14 men of war and 2 fireships, the second under John Everts of the like force, the third commanded by Admiral Courtenay, consisting of 14 men of war and 1 fireship, the fourth under Stillingwert, composed likewise of 14 men of war and a fireship, the fifth conducted by Van Tromp, the son of the famous old admiral who fought with Blake, made up of 16 men of war and 2 fireships, the sixth under Cornelius Everts, consisting of 14 men of war and a fireship, the seventh commanded by Schramm, comprising 16 men of war and 2 fireships, in all 103 men of war, 11 fireships and 7 yachts. A mighty fleet indeed. The Duke of York, having retired with our navy from the Dutch coast when they came out, afforded them the opportunity to fall upon our Hamburg fleet, which they did not neglect, capturing the greater part of it, whereby our merchants suffered a loss of nearly 200,000 pounds. This exceedingly exasperated the English, and at the same time gave great encouragement to the Dutch. Admiral Opdam, who commanded the latter, was a prudent as well as a truly gallant commander, but he was not allowed the liberty of action absolutely necessary at such a crisis. No sooner was he out at sea than he received a letter from the States directing him to fight at all events, and this order he resolved to obey, though contrary to the advice of most of his officers and to his own opinion. "I am," said he, addressing the council of war, "entirely in your sentiments, but here are my orders. Tomorrow my head shall be bound with laurel or with cypress." On June 3 the English and Dutch navies engaged about 3 in the morning off Lowestoft, when the English had the weather gauge, an advantage they knew how to use as well as keep. Things went at first very equally on both sides, several squadrons charging through and through without any remarkable advantage. But about noon, the Earl of Sandwich, with the Blue Squadron, fell into the center of the Dutch fleet and divided it into two parts, thus beginning the confusion which ended in their defeat. The Duke of York in the Royal Charles, a ship of 80 guns, and Admiral Opdam in the Eendracht of 84 were closely engaged. The fight continued for some hours with great obstinacy, and the Duke was often in the utmost danger. Several persons of distinction were killed on board his ship, particularly the Earl of Falmouth, the King's favourite, Lord Muskerry, and Mr. Boyle, son to the Earl of Cork, with one ball, and so near the Duke that he was covered with their blood and brains. Nay, a splinter from the last-mentioned gentleman's skull raised his hand. About one, the Dutch admiral blew up with a prodigious noise, but how the accident occurred is not known. In this vessel, together with Admiral Opdam, perished 500 men, only 5 of the whole crew escaping, many of those lost being volunteers of the best families of Holland, and not a few Frenchmen, who had taken this opportunity of being present in a sea fight. A little after this unlucky blow, the Dutch received a greater. 4 fine ships, the largest of 60, the least of 40 guns, ran foul of each other and were burnt by one fireship, and soon after, 3 larger vessels, by the same accident, shared the same fate. The Orange, a ship of 75 guns, after a most gallant defense, was also burnt, and thus, towards 4 in the afternoon, all fell into confusion. Vice Admiral Stillingworth was shot through the middle by a cannonball, and Vice Admiral Courtenaire received a shot in his thigh, of which he instantly died. Their ships bearing out of the line on the death of their commanders, without striking their flags, drew many after them, so that, by 8 at night, Tromp, who held out bravely to the last, and fought retreating, had not more than 30 ships left with him. According to English accounts, the Dutch had 18 ships taken, and 14 sunk in this action, besides such as were burnt or blown up. Yet their accounts admit of no more than 9 ships taken, 1, their admiral, blown up, and 8 burnt. The English lost the Charity, a ship of 46 guns, with most of her men, in the beginning of the fight, about 250 men killed and 340 wounded. On the other side, they lost at least 6,000 men, including 2,300 taken prisoners. There is very little room for doubt that if there had not been some mismanagement on the side of the English, this, which was the first, might also have been the last action in this war, for the Dutch fleet fled in great confusion, and if the English had pressed them vigorously, as they might have done, having the wind, so many ships might have been either sunk, disabled, or taken as must have forced a peace. In favor of which there was a very strong party in Holland, who did not like the domination of the pensionary De Witt, and the dependence in which he held the states, who seldom ventured to do anything of importance when he was absent. This great opportunity was lost through the English fleet's slacking sail in the night, contrary, it is said, to the express directions of His Royal Highness the Duke before retiring to rest. It is far from being an easy matter to determine how this came to pass, but the circumstances appear to have been as follows. The Duke, as Lord High Admiral, had 2 captains on board his ship, Sir William Penn, who had the rank of a vice-admiral, and Captain, afterwards Sir John Harmon. Sir William had retired as well as the Duke, so that the command remained with Captain Harmon, who was himself at the helm, when one Mr. Brouncker, who was of the Duke's bedchamber, came and told him that he ought to consider how much His Royal Highness's person had been already exposed in the action, and how much greater risk he might run if their ship, which was the headmost of the fleet, should fall in single with those of the enemy upon their own coasts. Harmon heard him, but answered like an honest brave man as he was that he could do nothing without orders. Brouncker upon this went to the Duke's cabin and returned with orders, in His Royal Highness's name, to make less sail. These Captain Harmon, without the least scruple, obeyed, though it caused some confusion in the fleet, several ships coming very near to running foul of each other. In the morning the Duke expressed surprise and resentment at finding the fleet at such a distance from the Dutch, that there was no longer any hope of coming up with them. It then appeared that either through cowardice, or something worse, Brouncker had carried Captain Harmon orders which he never received. However, this was concealed from His Royal Highness at the time, and other excuses made, such as a brisk wind from shore and their fireships being all spent. The truth, however, was very soon whispered about, though the Duke was not acquainted with it for more than 6 months after. Upon which he discharged Brouncker his service, and would have done more if the celebrated Duchess of Cleveland, then Countess of Castlemaine, with whom he was a favorite, had not by her interest with the king protected him. However, at the end of the war, when the House of Commons was out of humor, the matter was mentioned and inquired into, upon which Brouncker, who was a member, was expelled the House and ordered to be impeached, but was never prosecuted. After the defeat of the Dutch off Harwich, the Duke of York returned to England to report himself to the king, and the command of the fleet now lying in Southwold Bay fell upon the Earl of Sandwich, who had contributed so much to the late victory. While here news reached the Earl that 2 rich Dutch squadrons had put to sea, whereupon he immediately prepared to follow them with Sir George Ayscue as vice-admiral, and Sir Thomas Tideman as admiral of the rear, determined either to intercept de Ruyter, the Dutch admiral, on his return, or to take and burn the Turkey and East India fleets of which they had news. Both these schemes were doomed to failure. De Ruyter returned unexpectedly by the north of Scotland and arrived safely in Holland, where he was immediately promoted to the chief command of the fleet. The Turkey and India fleet, consisting of 20 sail under the command of Commodore Bitter, took the same route, but having intelligence of the approach of the English, took shelter in the port of Bergen in Norway. Here the Danish governor promised them all the assistance he could give, and to strengthen his hands, the Dutch landed 41 pieces of cannon, which he disposed in a line in front of the port, the Dutch forming another line of their largest ships across the bay, and then waiting the arrival of the English fleet. Bergen, being a neutral port, ought to have been an asylum of safety for these Dutch merchantmen, but the King of Denmark, hoping to share the plunder, showed himself willing to treat with the Earl of Sandwich for liberty to attack the convoy in port. The Earl, however, had no desire to share the spoil, and, impatient of delay, ordered Sir Thomas Tideman with 14 sail of men of war and 3 fireships to enter the bay and cut out the Dutch squadron. This he attempted with great courage, though the wind was against him, and he had to face a fierce fire from the castle, the line of guns, and the Dutch ships. Eventually, he was compelled to bear out of the bay, which he succeeded in doing without the loss of a ship, though 5 or 6 of his squadron were very much damaged. To relieve the Dutch squadron, now practically prisoners in the port of Bergen, the Dutch manned a stout fleet, which put to sea under the command of Admiral Ruyter, who was accompanied by De Witt, appointed, with 2 other deputies by the States, to attend upon the admiral. After meeting with many difficulties, the Dutch fleet succeeded in eluding that of the English, and arrived safely before Bergen, where, in the meantime, their friends had found a new enemy in their old defender. The Danish governor had modestly desired 100,000 crowns for the assistance he had given them in the late affair with the English, and had threatened to sink them without ceremony if they offered to stir out of the port before they had complied with his demand. The arrival of de Ruyter's fleet made him change his tone, and he allowed them to sail without paying the money, but kept the cannon they had put ashore. Thus far, the Dutch were very successful, but on their return home the fleet was scattered by a storm, in which they lost 2 fireships and some of the merchantmen. The vice-admiral and rear-admiral of the East India fleet, ships of very great value with 4 men of war, were taken by 5 English frigates, which the same storm had separated from their fleet, and soon after 4 of their men of war, 2 fireships, and 30 merchantmen joined our fleet instead of their own, and through this mistake were all taken prisoners. This ended the operations of the year 1665. The year 1666 opened upon a new condition of affairs, the French having declared in favor of the Dutch. Charles II recalled his ambassador, Lord Hals, from the French court and sent the Earl of Sandwich as ambassador to Spain, placing the fleet under the command of Prince Rupert and the Duke of Albemarle, who had one distinction as General Monk, the former to look after the French, who began to talk very high, and the latter to act against the Dutch. Prince Rupert and the Duke of Albemarle went on board the fleet on April 1666, and sailed with it in the beginning of May. Towards the latter end of the month, a rumor reached the English court that the French fleet, under the command of the Duke of Beaufort, was coming out to the assistance of the Dutch, and orders were immediately dispatched to Prince Rupert to sail with the White Squadron to engage it, which order he proceeded to obey. As Prince Rupert sailed from the Downs, the Dutch with their whole force put to sea, the wind at northeast and blowing a fresh gale. This brought the Dutch fleet onto the coast of Dunkirk and carried away His Highness towards the Isle of Wight, but the wind suddenly shifting to the southwest and blowing hard brought both the Dutch and the Duke of Albemarle with his 2 squadrons to an anchor. Captain Bacon in the Bristol first discovered the enemy, and by firing his guns, gave notice of it to the English fleet. The departure of Prince Rupert had left the Duke of Albemarle with but 60 sail, whereas the Dutch fleet consisted of 91 men of war, carrying 4,716 guns, and 22,462 men. But a council of war was called, wherein, without much debate, it was resolved to fight the enemy, notwithstanding their great superiority. It was the 1st of June when the Dutch fleet was discovered, and the Duke was so warm for engaging that he attacked the enemy without giving them time to weigh anchor, as de Ruyter himself says in his letter, compelling them to cut their cables to make ready for the fight. In the same letter de Ruyter says that to the last the English were the aggressors, notwithstanding their inferiority of force. The English fleet had the weather gauge, but the wind bowed their ships so much that they could not use their lowest tier. Sir William Berkeley's squadron led the van. The Duke of Albemarle, when he came on the coast of Dunkirk to avoid running full on the sand, made a sudden tack, and this brought his topmast by the board, which compelled him to lie by 4 or 5 hours till another could be set up. The Blue Squadron, knowing nothing of this, sailed on, charging through the Dutch fleet, though they were 5 to 1. In this engagement fell the brave Sir William Berkeley, and his ship, the Swifter, a second-rate, was taken. So was the Essex, a third-rate. And Sir John Harmon, in the Henry, had the whole Zealand squadron to deal with. His ship being disabled, the Dutch Admiral Cornelius Everts called to Sir John and offered him quarter, who answered, "No, sir, it is not come to that yet," and immediately discharged a broadside, by which Everts was killed and several of his ships damaged. This so discouraged their captains that they quitted the Henry and sent 3 fireships to burn her. The first grappled on her starboard quarters, and there began to raise so thick a smoke that it was impossible to perceive where the irons were fixed. At last, when the ship began to blaze, the boatswain of the Henry threw himself on board her, and having, by her own light, discovered and removed the grappling irons, in the same instant jumped back on board his own ship. He had scarcely done this before another fireship was fixed on the larboard, which did its business so effectually that the sails, being quickly on fire, frightened the chaplain and 50 men overboard. Upon this, Sir John drew his sword, and threatened to kill any man who should attempt to provide for his own safety by leaving the ship. This obliged them to endeavor to put out the fire, which in a short time they did. But the cordage being burnt, the crossbeam fell and broke Sir John's leg, at which instant the third fireship bore down upon him, but 4 pieces of cannon loaded with chainshot disabled her, so that, after all, Sir John brought his ship into Harwich, where he repaired her as well as he could, and notwithstanding his broken leg, put to sea again to seek the Dutch. The battle ended on the first day about 10 in the evening. The following night was spent in repairing the damage suffered on both sides, and next morning the attack was renewed by the English with fresh vigor. Admiral Van Tromp, with Vice Admiral van der Hulst, being on board one ship, rashly engaged it among the English, and their vessel was in the utmost danger of being either taken or burnt. The Dutch affairs, according to their own account, were now in a desperate condition, but Admiral de Ruyter at last disengaged them, though not till his ship was disabled and Vice Admiral van der Hulst killed. This only changed the scene, for de Ruyter was now as hard-pressed as Tromp had been before. However, a reinforcement arriving preserved him also, and so the second day's fight ended earlier than the first. The third day the Duke of Albemarle found it necessary to retreat, and he performed it with wonderful courage and skill. He first burnt 3 ships that were absolutely disabled. He next caused such as were most torn to sail before, and with 28 men of war that were in a pretty good condition, brought up the rear. Sir John Harmon, indeed, says he had but 16 ships that were able to fight. Yet in the evening, his Grace, discovering the White Squadron coming to his assistance, resolved to engage the enemy again. In joining Prince Rupert a very unlucky accident happened, for Sir George Ayscue, who was on board the Royal Prince, the largest and heaviest ship in the whole fleet, ran upon the galloper, and being there in danger of burning, and past all hope of relief, was forced to surrender, and the night falling ended this day's engagement. On June the 4th, the Dutch, who were still considerably stronger than the English, were almost out of sight. But the Duke of Albemarle, having prevailed upon the prince to follow them, about 8 in the morning they engaged again, and the English fleet charged 5 times through the Dutch, till Prince Rupert's ship being disabled, and that of the Duke of Albemarle very roughly handled. About 7 in the evening the fleets separated, each side being willing enough to retire. In this day's engagement fell that gallant admiral, Sir Christopher Mings, who, having a shot in the neck, remained upon deck and gave orders, keeping the blood from flowing with his fingers for above an hour, till another shot pierced his throat and put an end to his pain. This was the most terrible battle fought in this war. De Witt said roundly upon this occasion, if the English were beaten, their defeat did them more honor than all their former victories, and all the Dutch had discovered was that Englishmen might be killed and English ships burnt, but that English courage was invincible. After all, it is by no means easy to say who were victors upon the whole, or what was the loss of the vanquished. Some Dutch writers talk of 35 ships, and between 5,000 and 6,000 men lost by the English, which is more than half their fleet, and very little less than all their seamen. Other authorities, however, compute our loss at 16 men of war, of which 10 were sunk and 6 taken. Our writers say the Dutch lost 15 men of war, 21 captains, and 5,000 men, and they themselves own to the loss of 9 ships and a prodigious slaughter of their seamen. After the 4 days' fight, the Dutch had once more the credit of appearing at sea before the English, their ships having suffered less in that protracted conflict. It was not long, however, before the English fleet appeared. It consisted of 80 men of war, great and small, and 19 fireships, divided into 3 squadrons. The Red, under Prince Rupert and the Duke of Albemarle, who were on board the same ship with Sir Joseph Jordan for their vice-admiral and Sir Robert Holmes for their rear-admiral. Sir Thomas Allen was Admiral of the White, and had under him Sir Thomas Tideman and Rear-Admiral Utbert. Sir Jeremiah Smith carried the blue flag, and his officers were Sir Edward Spragg and Rear-Admiral Kempthorne. The Dutch, according to their own accounts, had 88 men of war and 20 fireships, divided also into 3 squadrons, under Lieutenant Admiral de Ruyter, John Everts, brother to the admiral who was killed in the former engagement, and Van Tromp. On July the 25th, about noon, the English came up with the enemy off the North Foreland. Sir Thomas Allen, with the White Squadron, began the battle by attacking Everts. Prince Rupert and the Duke, about 1 in the afternoon, made a desperate attack upon de Ruyter, whose squadron was in the center of the Dutch fleet, but after fighting about 3 hours, were obliged to go on board another ship. In this interim, the White Squadron had entirely defeated their enemies. Admiral John Everts, his vice-admiral, de Vries, and his rear-admiral, Koenders, being all killed, the vice-admiral of Zeeland taken, and another ship of 50 guns burnt. The Prince and Duke fought de Ruyter ship to ship, disabled the Gelderland, of 66 guns, which was one of his seconds, killed the captain of another, and mortally wounded 2 more, upon which some of the Dutch ships began to retreat. However, Vice-Admiral Van Ness stood bravely by de Ruyter, and his ship received great damage. Yet, being at last deserted by all but 7 ships, they yielded to necessity, and followed the rest of their fleet to sea. This was the clearest victory gained during the whole war. The Dutch lost 20 ships, 4 admirals were killed and a great many captains. As to private men, there might be about 4,000 slain and 3,000 wounded. The English had only the Resolution burnt, 3 captains killed, and about 300 private men. By the end of the year 1666, however, both nations had become weary of the war, and the King of Sweden having offered his mediation, it was readily accepted by both sides. Negotiations were immediately set on foot, which ultimately resulted in the Treaty of Breda. But in the meantime, the Dutch rather increased than relaxed their efforts to strengthen their navy, hoping thereby to influence the terms of the treaty in process of negotiation. Having previously sounded the mouth of the Thames to ascertain how far it might be practicable to attempt to enter it with large ships, and having thereby discovered the facility with which such a project could be carried out, De Witt determined to make the attempt without delay. The Dutch fleet being ready, sailed over to the English coast, where it was joined by Van Ghent, and formed a fleet of 70 men of war besides fireships. On June 7 they attacked Sheerness, which was at that time unfinished and in no state of defense, and captured 15 iron guns and a considerable quantity of naval stores. The Duke of Albemarle, Sir Edward Spragg, and other officers had made all imaginable provision for the defense of the River Medway, by sinking ships in the passage, throwing a chain across it, and placing 3 large vessels, which had been taken from the Dutch, behind the chain. The Dutch, however, had the advantage of a strong easterly wind, which encouraged them to make an attempt upon our ships at Chatham, in spite of the precautions taken to preserve them. It was on June the 12th that they executed this design. which, however, would have miscarried at last, if one Captain Brakel, who was a prisoner on board their fleet for some misdemeanor, had not offered to wipe out the memory of his former mistake by breaking the chain, a service which he gallantly performed. Captain Brakel also with great bravery boarded and took one of the English frigates which guarded the passage, and soon after the Matthias, the Unity, and the Charles V, the ships which had been taken from the Dutch, were set on fire. The next day, the advantage of wind and tide continuing, the Dutch advanced with 6 men of war and 5 fireships as high as Upnor Castle, but were so warmly received that they were obliged to return. However, as they came back, they burnt the Royal Oak, a very fine ship, and in her Captain Douglas, who chose to be burnt with her rather than live to be reproached with having deserted his command. On the 14th they carried off the hull of the Royal Charles, notwithstanding all the English could do to prevent it, a project which they had dearly at heart. On their return, 2 Dutch men of war ran ashore in the Medway and were burnt, which, with 8 fireships consumed in the action and 150 men killed, is all the loss acknowledged by the Dutch writers, though it is not improbable that they really suffered much more. De Ruyter, highly pleased with what he had performed, left Admiral Van Ness with part of his fleet in the mouth of the Thames, and sailed with the rest to Portsmouth, in the hope of burning the ships there. Failing in this design, he sailed westward to Torbay, where he was likewise repulsed. Then he returned back again to the mouth of the Thames, and with 25 sail came as high as the Hope, where our squadron lay under the command of Sir Edward Spragg. This consisted of 18 sail. Yet, the admiral not being on board when the enemy began the attack, the English fleet suffered at first from their fireships. But Sir Edward repairing to his command, and being joined by Sir Joseph Jordan with a few small ships, quickly forced the Dutch to retire. The like success attended their attack on Landguard Fort, which was performed by 1,600 men, commanded by Colonel Dolman, a Republican, under the fire of their whole fleet. But Governor Darrell, an old Cavalier, beat them off with great loss. On the 23rd, Van Ness sailed again up the river as far as the Hope, where he engaged Sir Edward Spragg, who had with him 5 frigates and 17 fireships. This proved a very sharp action, at least between the fireships, of which the Dutch writers themselves confess they spent 11 to our 8. The next day the English attacked the Dutch in their turn, and notwithstanding their superiority, forced them to retire and to burn the only fireship they had left, to prevent her being taken. On the 25th they bore out of the river with all the sail they could make, followed at a distance by Sir Edward Spragg and his remaining fireships. On the 26th, in the mouth of the river, they were met by another English squadron from Harwich, consisting of 5 men of war and 14 fireships. These boldly attacked the Dutch, and grappled the Vice-Admiral of Zealand and another large ship, but were not able to fire them, though they frightened 100 of their men into the sea. In this struggle the Rear-Admiral of Zealand was forced on shore, and so much damaged thereby as to be obliged to return home. While the whole Dutch fleet was employed in alarming our coasts, Sir Jeremiah Smith was sent with a small squadron northwards, with which, and the assistance of a numerous fleet of privateers, already abroad for their own profit, the Dutch commerce to the Baltic was in a manner ruined, and multitudes of rich prizes were daily brought into English ports. Thus it may be truly said that the nations at this time changed characters. The Dutch preferred the insult at Chatham, which, all things considered, was of little or no consequence to them, to the preservation of their trade, and the English endeavored to make themselves amends for this unexpected loss of a few men of war by taking numbers of merchantmen. The English in the West Indies took the island of St. Eustatia, Saba, St. Martin, Buin Air, the island of Tobago, and other places from the Dutch. On the contrary, the Dutch, under the conduct of Commodore Crinson, made themselves masters of Suriname, and the French, assisted by the Dutch, almost deprived the English of their half of the island of St. Christopher, after several obstinate disputes, and the death of their commander La Salles. 6 frigates and some other small vessels from Barbados, sailing from thence to repair this loss, were so ill-treated by a violent storm that they were put out of a condition to execute their design, and 2 or 3 of the most disabled ships fell into the hands of the enemy, though, before their misfortune, they had burnt 2 Dutch ships richly laden in the harbor of Los Santos. There were 3 distinct treaties of peace signed at Breda respectively, with the Dutch, the French, and the Danes, and these were ratified on August 24, 1667. The terms upon which this peace was made were safe and honorable at least, though not so glorious and beneficial as might have been expected after such a war. By it the honor of the flag was secured, and the island of Polron, to prevent further disputes, was yielded to the Dutch. In the West Indies we kept all that we had taken, except Suriname, and the French were obliged to restore what they had taken from us.